The wooden golem hit the arena floor in 3 separate pieces. Each impact shook the bleachers. 500 students who had come expecting a clean, one-sided beating now stared at the wreckage of a third-year senior's trump card. Mo Young-jun sat in the settling dust where the shockwave had thrown him, his earth magic completely spent, his carefully laid ambush reduced to splinters of enchanted timber across the stone floor. He had summoned that golem with 30 minutes of preparatory ritual. It had lasted less than 7 seconds. The boy responsible was already walking back toward the arena's edge. He carried a plain wooden staff. His academy uniform was a size too large on the shoulders. He looked, in every measurable sense, like a student who had no business winning that fight. Instructor Lee Soo-dok stood in the upper viewing booth with his arms folded. He had been watching this particular student for 3 weeks, since a dungeon test had produced the highest score in recent academy history and left behind a blank replay log. He still couldn't make sense of him. In his experience, the genuinely strong ones wanted to be known. This one seemed to put considerable effort into making sure no one could see him clearly. He wrote nothing in his notes. He kept watching. The story didn't start in that arena. It didn't start at Dragon Slayer Academy at all. It started in front of a monitor, in the real world, at 2 in the morning, with a notification that had never appeared before. Kim Ho had spent 4 years inside Dragon Slayer Academy. The game. Not casually. He had cleared every dungeon, maxed every support build, studied every combat mechanic until the systems felt like reflexes. 1,000 S-rank hero creations. That was the number he'd reached on the night everything changed, and the game acknowledged it with a spinning gold trophy animation he had never seen before. Then a second window opened behind it. Plain white text on black, no fanfare. He stared at it for a long moment. EX wasn't a tier that appeared in the standard progression. He pressed accept mostly out of habit, the way he had pressed accept on thousands of other quest windows over 4 years. The monitor's light went out, so did the room, and then everything else. He woke in a forest with damp earth under his hands and smoke somewhere in the air. He recognized the smell immediately, the Academy Games tutorial zone, heavy with ozone and old rot. He called up his status screen. Everything at 0, or near enough that the difference didn't matter. No copied skills, no mana reserves worth measuring, no carried over progress. The game's starting conditions, applied to a body with real lungs that were already burning from the forest air. The ground shook before he could finish reading. 2 dragons broke through the canopy about 200 meters north, mid-combat, tearing at each other, with claws and breath that stripped trees in 40-meter swaths. The shockwave from a single tail strike reached him as a wall of displaced air that knocked him sideways into a ditch. He stayed low and watched the one on the left. Its chest was building pressure, scales vibrating along the underside of the throat, a deep internal glow brightening with each breath. Dragon's Breath, S rank. In 4 years of running this game, he had never seen a starting character possess it. His copy skill had no mana cost. It needed one thing: contact at the precise moment of execution, or a clean direct observation of the ability firing. He did the math on his remaining options. He ran toward the dragon. Not straight at it, the angle mattered. He used the crash of the other dragon's tail strike as cover, moving through the smoke in a flat sprint that turned his lungs to fire after the first 100 meters. His stats were nearly nothing. His legs understood this. He ran anyway, closing the gap to the glowing dragon's foreleg as the breath built toward its peak. He pressed his palm flat against the scaled foreleg. The copy skill registered at the exact moment the breath fired, and the heat came through his skin like pressing against a furnace door. He was already sprinting south when the blast discharged, and the shockwave caught him anyway, lifting him off his feet and throwing him 40 meters into a tree. He lay against the bark for a moment, checking that his ribs hadn't folded. They hadn't. Skill copied, Dragon's Breath, S rank. Current mana, insufficient to activate. He couldn't use it yet. That was fine. He sat up, removed a piece of bark from his collar, and walked toward the transport station. An S rank skill, in the first 5 minutes, at level 0. The foundation was there. He just had to build the rest of it around the foundation, one piece at a time. The academy train ran once a week and took 6 hours across open sea. Kim Ho found a window seat in the third car and spent the first stop cataloging the passengers. Most of the new intake traveled in factional clusters. Murim students in clean, structured robes, Guild Federation candidates comparing gear, Magic Tower applicants holding grimoires they'd probably owned for years. He looked like none of them. Plain clothing, no affiliation marker, a cheap wooden staff he'd bought at the station for a fraction of what students around him had spent on their equipment. He also had a small bag of cookies from the station bakery. He ate 2 of them as the coast disappeared behind the train. A seat opened next to him 2 stops in. The young man who dropped into it was broad across the shoulders, with a sword on his back that had seen actual work. Not display wear, real wear. The kind that came from training past the point of comfort. He introduced himself without waiting to be asked. Go Hyun-woo, Murim section, sword cultivator. He had the earnest directness of someone who hadn't yet learned that most people found sincerity disarming. Kim Ho nodded along. In 4 years of playthroughs, Hyun-woo had been one of the central protagonists of the Academy's main story. Righteous, skilled, and carrying a sealed sacred relic inside that sword that he assumed nobody had noticed. He was also, in Kim Ho's accumulated experience, the most reliably loyal person in the entire game. Across the aisle, a girl had fallen asleep against the window. She was slim, white-haired, with a sniper's case propped next to her that was almost as tall as she was. A cookie had slipped from her hand while she slept and was now resting on her own sleeve. She hadn't noticed. Her breathing was even. She had, by the evidence available, fallen asleep in the middle of eating. That was Se-yun, classified as a gunner and sniper, a rare and powerful class that demanded technical training she had never received. Her file in the game listed her as chronically unmotivated, perpetually hungry, and essentially impossible to interest in formal instruction. Her actual potential was something the game never fully showed, because every playthrough Kim Ho had run, she'd stayed untrained. He had thoughts about changing that. The situation started in the front car during the second hour. A student from the disciplinary committee was running what any honest observer would call an extortion scheme, dressed up in the language of a safety inspection. Han So-mi, blue armband, committee insignia, a smile that had probably worked on a lot of people, had found a smaller boy in the aisle who had a lockpick visible in his breast pocket. He was explaining, with failing conviction, that everything in his bag was perfectly normal. Kim Ho had walked past the open bag. Nothing in it was remotely normal. He also recognized the boy. That was Shin, a member of the Thieves Club, the Academy's informal network of scammers, information brokers, and light-fingered problem solvers. Shin was the group's lockpicker and mechanic, which meant those tools weren't incidental. Shin was approximately 15 seconds from losing his entire inventory to a committee member who would absolutely use all of it. Han So-mi launched her attack in the middle of a sentence. The lightning hummingbird, a small, blindingly fast projectile of compressed electric current, her signature technique, snapped across the aisle at face level. Its speed was the whole point. Most people registered it existed only after it had already arrived. It arrived at Kim Ho's eye level. He was walking past the row. He looked at it for a fraction of a second, reached out, and caught it between 2 fingers. The hummingbird buzzed and sparked against his knuckles. He turned it over once with the mild curiosity of someone examining a coin he'd found on the floor, then set it down on the nearest armrest. Han So-mi stared at him. He apologized, very pleasantly. He explained that he'd been reaching down for a cookie he'd dropped and had apparently gotten in the way of something. He hoped he hadn't disrupted anything important. He offered her the bag. She did not take the cookie. She looked at his hand, the scorch marks across his first 2 fingers, and then at his plain gray uniform with no visible rank or faction. She spent 4 seconds trying to categorize him. Then she decided this had not happened in a way she could put in a report, stepped back, and moved on. Shin exhaled slowly. Kim Ho returned to his seat. He told Hyun-woo, who had watched the whole exchange with considerable tension, that his fingers were fine. The rear car had a modified slot machine bolted to the wall beside the food concession, operating on a token system that most students treated as light entertainment. Kim Ho had analyzed its payout cycle in 3 separate playthroughs. He knew within 4 spins when it was going to land the rare material drop. He waited. He played it at the correct moment. A black ice crystal landed in the tray, a C-rank material used in mana core construction, far ahead of what any first-year student should have this early in their career. He pocketed it without changing his expression. Hyun-woo found him afterward in a more immediate problem. Han So-mi had recovered her composure and found a second target. Hyun-woo's sealed relic made his power readings significantly lower than his actual capability, which gave the committee grounds to challenge him to a validation duel. Hyun-woo had accepted with the resignation of someone accustomed to this particular inconvenience. Kim-ho stood at Hyun-woo's shoulder before the match started, and spent 30 seconds doing something that looked, from a distance, like adjusting his own sleeve. The buff he placed tripled Hyun-woo's sword output for 2 minutes. He stepped back. The duel lasted 40 seconds. Han So-mi didn't land a clean strike. She wrote both their names in her committee log. Kim-ho watched her write them and was not particularly worried. Being noticed was tolerable. Being understood was what he was protecting against. Dragon Slayer Academy had been built on an island that, 40 years ago, was nothing but classified dungeon territory. The founders had cleared the land by beating its original bosses and built an institution on top of the network they'd conquered. The dungeon levels beneath the campus were now used for controlled student testing. The fact that significant portions remained active and uncleared was, officially, considered a feature of the educational environment. Kim-ho sat through the welcome address in the orientation hall and cataloged every face he could find. Committee members positioned in the back rows. Faction representatives along the walls. A handful of instructors he recognized from the game. Lee Soo-dok occupied the left corner. Tall, narrow-shouldered, wearing the expression of someone who had made a permanent professional decision to find everyone around him mildly disappointing. His title among students was the Human Butcher, which was perhaps slightly dramatic, but his actual function was identifying infiltrators and unauthorized personnel among the intake. He watched the new students with the sustained attention of someone who expected to find at least one problem. Kim-ho made sure his gaze pointed at the floor whenever Lee Soo-dok swept in his direction. The placement exam ran over 2 days in the arena. Brackets, single elimination, results determining rank assignment, tower affiliation, and course access. A poor placement was recoverable, but it cost time and positioned you badly for the first semester's resources. Kim-ho had been placed in the bronze bracket and waited in the holding area running through combat styles as the early matches played out. His first match was against a Ruby Tower student. The Fire Magic faction trained on aggression. She had a good staff, clean form, and a rising pillar technique that the tower's members ran with consistent confidence. She looked at Kim-ho's wooden staff and allowed herself a small, assuming smile. He let her open. The pillar hit the mat where he'd been standing, which he'd already vacated. She threw it again. He stepped again. She committed to her strongest variant, a triple rotation that transformed the column into a spiraling cage with no clean exit. He cast a basic lightning strike into the center channel before the rotation completed. Lightning fed into active fire caused a backflash that collapsed the cage inward, and while she spent 2 seconds recovering her formation, he threw a standard bolt through the disrupted defense. She went down. The scoring panel marked the time. In the viewing section, the Ruby Tower students debated whether she'd slipped on the mat. His second match was against Song Chun-hee. She walked onto the mat with the posture of someone who had spent years being accurately informed that she was exceptional. Granddaughter of the Lord of Thunder. B-rank lightning ability at entry level, which was genuinely unusual for a first year. She measured him once with her eyes and said, in a tone of complete neutrality, that she hoped he wouldn't waste her time. Kim-ho filed the paperwork for a voluntary forfeit before the opening signal. He walked back to the holding area while she stood on the mat watching the space where he had been. She looked at the officials. They confirmed, yes, voluntary forfeit, no appeal process. She received the bracket win. He received a placement score that buried him in the weakest division. He had planned both outcomes precisely. Fighting Chun-hee at this stage would have drawn exactly the kind of focused attention he was working to avoid. Her family connections meant every match she appeared in would be reviewed thoroughly. The forfeit cost him nothing he couldn't recover. Hyun-woo found him afterward in the corridor outside. He asked, very carefully, if Kim-ho was doing all right. Kim-ho told him the forfeit had been deliberate. Hyun-woo processed this for a moment. He had already decided to trust this person. Something in the way he'd handled the train had settled that question. He accepted the answer and asked no further questions, which was exactly the kind of ally Kim-ho had always found irreplaceable. The weeks after placement had a rhythm to them. He attended classes, he sat in the back. He asked questions that seemed like a beginner's questions but were designed to pull out specific operational data. patrol schedules, committee rotation timing, the current state of the lower dungeon access locks. He also spent significant time in the PvP arena's viewing gallery. The arena ran on a voluntary challenge system. Students registered open bouts, bet small stakes, and fought for ranking points. He used the gallery to build a detailed map of who could do what and how they did it. He watched Chun-Hee train over 3 sessions. She was genuinely strong, fast, clean technique, high natural output, but she over-relied on speed and didn't vary her approach enough. There was a tell in her right shoulder, a brief mechanical reset before her heaviest attacks. He stored that detail carefully. He also watched Seyeon, who technically belonged to the gunner track but had not been attending gunner track sessions. She sat in the gallery most days with a bag of snacks, watching matches with the mild interest of someone monitoring weather. When students near her practiced, her eyes moved across them, tracking their center of gravity, recoil patterns, and distance calibration. Automatic, precise, completely unconscious. She probably had no idea she was doing it. He stopped next to her one afternoon and watched the match below with her for a few minutes. She offered him a cookie without looking up. It was shaped like a small dinosaur, carefully pressed. He took it. He told her she had a natural precision targeting instinct that was being completely wasted. He said he could teach her to use it, if she wanted, because a trained sniper made every team around her stronger, and he was interested in building strong teams. She looked at him for a long moment, the cookie bag still in her lap. She asked him why he would bother with someone who didn't even want to try. He said that wanting to try was something that could be built, given the right structure, and that her instinct for it was already there. She just hadn't aimed it at anything. She thought about this. Then she offered him another cookie. He took that as a yes. The dungeon test came at the end of the first month. Each student entered alone. The point was accumulation. Kills, drops, zone clears, and the score was logged publicly after the time limit expired. The standard route for the assigned dungeon involved moving cautiously through the central corridor and taking safe, time-expensive kills. Kim Ho entered through the assigned gate and immediately took a different path. He knew Dungeon 15's full layout. Every spawn cluster, every high-value zone, every monster that dropped points disproportionate to its actual threat level. He moved through the dungeon without wasted motion, each kill the minimum force necessary, each route a straight line toward the next objective. He picked up weapons from fallen enemies and threw them before they broke. He cleared the 3 highest value zones in order, hit a bonus condition buried deep enough in the dungeon's programming that no first year was meant to find it this early, and came out in 3 minutes and 4 seconds. 683 points. The highest first-month dungeon score in the Academy's recent records. On his way out, he stopped at the replay log terminal. The Academy system allowed students to purchase privacy on their own match footage. You lost the official replay, but your score still counted. He paid the fee and walked back to the dormitory. The score posted to the public board within the hour. A crowd gathered around it. The number was remarkable. The absence of any attached footage was more remarkable. Lee Sudok stood in front of that board for a long time. The human butcher had seen strong students hide their techniques before. Students protected proprietary combat methods, unusual equipment, or training methods their families wanted kept confidential. What he had not seen before was a score that implied extraordinary ability, paired with a public record that showed nothing. No footage, no ranked history, a placement in the weakest division, and a voluntary forfeit in his second match against a known talent. He added Kim Ho's name to a list he kept for himself. Not an official report, not yet. Just a name, at the top of a page he intended to revisit. The Magitech workshop in the Academy's West Wing smelled like burnt copper and calibrated ambition. Kim Ho arrived during the second week's open craft hours and introduced himself to the third-year workshop lead, a student named Darim who had moved past passion into territoriality, and who took one look at his wooden staff and decided he was harmless. He spent 3 sessions there across a week. He asked questions that read as a curious beginner's questions. He handled the materials with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. He watched Darim work, and on the 3rd session, when she fired her calibration sequence, a specialized Magitech technique that could only be copied at the precise moment of execution, he was positioned 2 meters away with a clear sightline to every detail. On that same session, he found a rolled blueprint wedged behind the equipment shelf in Workshop 4. a 10 by 10 cube design with no legible purpose, too small to be useful as storage, too symmetric for any weapon, too elaborate to be decorative. Darim had thrown it out weeks earlier as a failed experiment. He took it home and looked at it for 20 minutes. The blueprint was wrong as written, but the core principle it was built around, a dimensional folding weave at the cube's center, was sound. Modify the internal lattice and add a mana lock on the outer sealing layer, and you'd produce a container that registered as completely inert under standard detection protocols. Not a deep scan, nothing held against that. But the Academy's banishment wave operated on surface resonance, not penetration. It swept the grounds at broad frequency and flagged anything that resonated like contraband. The cube wouldn't resonate at all. Whatever was placed inside it would disappear from the wave entirely. He bought components across 4 days from 5 different suppliers, splitting each purchase so no single transaction looked unusual. He assembled the cube in his dormitory room over 2 nights, working by lamplight rather than the overhead fixture. In the game, visible craft light during off hours was one of the more reliable ways to get caught. Old habits carried over without effort. The finished object sat in his palm, small enough to close a fist around, and looked from the outside like a competently made paperweight. A short mana pulse confirmed the internal space was stable. He named it the Cube of Life, partly because naming things helped him think about them clearly, and partly because calling it that struck him as slightly absurd, which he considered sufficient reason. He now had a detection-proof container. Tuesday's banishment wave was 4 days away. The wave hit at midday with no warning, the way the design intended. A low hum moved through the walls before it was audible, radiating outward from the central security tower in a way that students felt in their feet before they heard it in their ears. Those who'd survived a wave before went still. The rest looked around in confusion while the crawl of detection passed through every corridor, classroom, and storage space on the island simultaneously. Anyone carrying contraband had approximately 4 seconds. Kim Ho was in the east corridor. Shin arrived through a side door at a full run, both arms overflowing with items that collectively represented a dedicated list of Academy violations. Black market reagents, unlicensed skill books, tools with no plausible innocent interpretation. Shin saw him, his expression compressed through several rapid calculations. Kim Ho held out the cube and said 2 seconds. Everything went in. The wave moved through the east corridor with its sustained, foundational tone, ran its sweep, and continued onward. Not a single flag registered. When it had passed, Shin stood with his arms at his sides, breathing. He looked at the cube. He looked at Kim Ho. It was the specific look of someone realizing they've been significantly wrong about a person for some time. Kim Ho said he would like a meeting with whoever ran the Thieves' Club. He said he was free that evening. The club's actual leader was not what the name implied. Dang Ga-young held the legitimate title of Versatile Class Mentor, formally appointed, responsible for students who didn't fit cleanly into any standard faction track. She also ran, alongside this, a profitable operation built on rare information, carefully acquired materials, and a working philosophy that treated Academy regulations as guidelines designed for students who couldn't think around them. She was sharp, not in a hurried way, but in the way of someone who was always 3 moves ahead and had stopped feeling the need to announce it. She looked at Kim Ho across a table in the club's actual meeting space, below ground, 3rd sublevel, accessed through a door that required Shin's full toolkit to open, with the focused attention of someone assembling something they find more interesting than they expected. She asked what he wanted from the arrangement. He told her, access to the club's intelligence network, backup capacity on specific operations, and her silence about his real capability level. In return, she could have the cube, and she would have his full cooperation on any job where his skills were relevant. She examined the cube. She understood what it had done during the wave. She said, in the tone of someone already building a plan around his answer, that she had a job that might serve as a useful test of the arrangement. He said he was listening. The disciplinary committee's temporary warehouse relocated every 2 weeks. It was currently on the 3rd floor of the administration block, which gave them a 4-day window before the next move. It held, among other confiscated materials, several items Ga-young preferred not to remain in committee hands. The guard rotation cycled every 4 hours. 2 external access points, 1 internal checkpoint. Kim Ho ran the floor plan against his memory of the committee's patrol timing. The calculation took roughly 40 seconds. He said Thursday night worked. They entered the East Service Corridor at 11:15. Shin had the checkpoint seal open in under 2 minutes, a 5-layer defensive lock that most students didn't know existed, which was presumably the point. Ga-young moved through the building's maintenance channels with the ease of someone who'd mapped this specific route before for reasons she had never felt obligated to explain. Kim-ho followed, cataloging the committee's defensive layering as they worked deeper into the floor. The warehouse itself was reinforced. 3 stone dividers separated the main confiscation area from the emergency exit corridor. Academy standard barrier material, rated for C-rank physical assault, the kind used in high-security storage across every faction's facilities. The on-duty council member found them at the second divider. Sun Jae was older, a veteran student council member with combat capability well above first-year standard. He identified himself, sealed the room's exits with a containment barrier, and gave them a single opportunity to surrender. He said it in the tone of someone who expected the offer to be accepted. Kim-ho's fist hit the first stone divider. The ability he'd copied, cataloged in 3 previous playthroughs as a black market combat technique circulating in the game's underground, wasn't conventional fire magic. The Infernal Fist generated compressed combustion force with a structural penetration component built specifically to break defensive materials rather than burn them. Against stone rated for C-rank attacks, applied at the output level he'd reached through sustained practice, it performed significantly better than rated. The first divider shattered inward. He hit the second while the debris was still moving. The third he reached by rolling under the tail end of Sun Jae's containment barrier, and it fractured radially, scattering stone across half the room. Sun Jae deployed 3 high-tier barrier formations in sequence. The first buckled on contact. The second he dropped early when it became clear the structural load would overwhelm it anyway. He abandoned the third entirely and committed his mana to a direct attack, which was the decisive error. Close range was where Infernal Fist lived, and Sun Jae had just closed the distance for him. 2 more strikes. Sun Jae hit the far wall and stayed there, not critically injured but completely out of the fight, which was all the margin the team needed. Ga-young had already found her items. Shin was at the exit. The official committee log registered an unconfirmed breach. 3 destroyed dividers. 1 incapacitated council member. No conclusive perpetrators. The recording orb had been in the wrong position when the dividers came down. The footage showed only stone dust. They were back in the underground corridor before midnight. Kim-ho flexed his right hand once, noted the bruising across his knuckles, and let it settle. He sold the Cube of Life within the week. Park Nari, the Guild Union's acquisitions buyer, ran 2 detection probes against it, found nothing either time, and looked at him with the expression of someone doing rapid arithmetic that was coming out in his favor. She asked him what he wanted for it. 2 things: 12 months of VIP priority access to the dungeon and arena systems, and 1 blank skill book, a rare material capable of absorbing and preserving a single copied technique in stable form for later activation. She agreed. He already knew which technique he intended to write in the book. Moyong-jun issued the challenge in the 2nd month, loudly enough at lunch that most of the surrounding tables heard it. He was Murim faction, 3rd in his year group by rank, and had spent the first month constructing a specific kind of reputation, the sort that required identifying a target and demonstrating something on them publicly. Kim-ho's dungeon score had put him on a short list of interesting candidates, and the forfeit against Chun-hee combined with a low placement rank made him look like the safest option on that list. Jun announced the match with the confidence of someone who had already decided how it would end. Kim-ho accepted. He had been expecting this kind of challenge, more or less. The specific conditions were useful. A public arena match, registered, full gallery. He needed 1 controlled public demonstration. Something that would shift his reputation slightly without exposing the depth of what he actually carried. Jun's challenge was a convenient vehicle for that, and Jun would not enjoy being a vehicle. Jun opened with layered earth magic, heavy and structured. Cracks spread across the arena floor in directed channels, extending under Kim-ho's position to destabilize his footing, and a compression strike followed. Several hundred kilograms of consolidated rock driving toward the center of the floor at speed. Kim-ho stepped out of the terrain without apparent concern, let the compression strike land on empty ground, and threw a piece of rubble at Jun's face. It hit. Jun had been tracking the space where Kim-ho was supposed to be pinned, and hadn't adjusted his sightline fast enough. The throw was not a damaging move, it was a deliberate choice, a specific communication that required no explanation. The gallery registered it the way crowds register genuinely unexpected things. A beat of complete quiet, and then murmuring. June summoned the golem. 20 meters of animated timber. A third-year technique applied to a first-year match, which was several levels beyond anything permitted at this stage, and which June had obviously prepared carefully over time. The gallery leaned forward. June announced to the room that this was the appropriate conclusion. He said Kim Ho had made a habit of embarrassing himself, and that it ended now. Kim Ho raised his staff and released a wind technique. Not a visually striking one, at the scale he used it. Wind magic occupied the utility tier in the Academy's ranking system, supplemental, supportive, secondary to the major elemental classes. What it was not, in the hands of someone who had spent 2 weeks working specifically on its structural force applications with priority arena access, was cosmetically weak. The buff he layered into the release scaled the technique's rotational force well past what wind magic at this development stage was rated to reach. The golem's joint structures went first, then the torso. The head impacted the arena floor and sent a shockwave through the bleachers that people felt in their seats, and the gallery went entirely silent. June sat in the settling dust with his earth magic spent and his carefully prepared trump card in pieces on the stone. He looked at the wreckage for a moment, then he looked at Kim Ho. Kim Ho was already walking toward the exit. In the upper booth, Lee Soo-dok added a second notation to the name at the top of his personal list. He underlined it. The ability source was still unclear. Not a registered technique, not affiliated with any known Murim or Tower style. He intended to trace it before he escalated anything formally. He was getting closer to the shape of the problem. He just hadn't found its center yet. The team testing session with Seo Yun began the following week. She arrived with a container of cookies shaped like rabbits. She had apparently moved on from dinosaurs, though she offered no explanation for the transition, and the particular air of someone who had decided to attempt something without yet deciding to care about it. She stood at the practice range with her case open, loaded a single round, and waited with the patience of someone who was genuinely not in a hurry. He didn't tell her to fire. He asked her to watch the target at 20 meters and describe what she saw. She described it precisely. Not in general terms, she identified the specific point of lowest structural density, the micro-vibration pattern indicating directional response under impact, and the optimal firing window given current ambient wind conditions she had registered without being asked to register them. Every element correct. All of it substantially more sophisticated than anything a first-year gunner without formal training should be producing. She finished the description and looked at him with the slightly suspicious expression of someone who has just done something they weren't certain they knew how to do. He said, "Now shoot." The round hit the optimal point she'd described. The target came apart at the structural weakness she'd identified before she fired. She looked at it for a moment, then at the next target in the range line. He watched the quiet internal decision happen, the one where a person stops waiting to care about something and becomes genuinely interested in it. It was subtle, a slight shift in her posture, the way her eyes moved to the next target without waiting to be directed there. He told her they had 3 weeks before the Guardian evaluation. He said her projection capabilities hadn't been developed yet. He said they had substantial work ahead. She offered him a rabbit cookie. He took it as confirmation. The dungeon notification came 2 days after that. Dungeon 388, the Altar of the Feathered Serpent, was listed in the Academy's active restricted access system. 3rd-year clearance required. Formal instructor approval mandatory for any descent. The specific item located in its deep level, the Shaman's Sword, was something Kim Ho had been tracking across multiple playthroughs as a critical upgrade for Hyunwoo's combat framework. The sealed relic in Hyunwoo's sword was beginning to create pressure problems. Without an external anchor for the relic's output, Hyunwoo's long-term combat reliability had a ceiling he would hit sooner than he expected. Kim Ho pulled Hyunwoo and Shin aside after dinner. He laid it out clearly. The dungeon was restricted access, the descent was illegal, the risks were real, and the outcome was worth the risks. Hyunwoo asked no questions about the legality and several questions about the preparation requirements. Shin asked about the Shaman Sword's market value, which Kim Ho answered accurately, so the calculation would come out correctly. Both of them said yes. They confirmed for Thursday. What none of them discussed, because Kim Ho didn't mention it and the other two couldn't have known to ask, was what he'd seen in every previous playthrough when the Shaman Sword's dungeon boss reached its second phase. The tribal chief of the Feathered Serpent altar was manageable in Phase 1. In Phase 2, it became a threat that required someone to take it on alone while the others secured the target item. He had known, from the moment he suggested the descent, that he would be the one handling Phase 2 by himself. He spent Wednesday night running through the ability set he'd built so far and confirming which combination would get him through it. They went down at 1 in the morning on Thursday, through an access panel Shin had mapped 3 weeks earlier during what he'd officially logged as a maintenance inspection. The tunnel below it was unlit past the first 30 meters, which meant Shin navigated by instrument. Hyun-woo held a small purchased Magitech light low against the ground, and Kim Ho moved from memory. He had run this dungeon's approach 11 times across previous playthroughs. The tunnel still smelled exactly the same, damp stone and something older underneath, the specific mineral scent of earth that hadn't seen air in a long time. The altar of the Feathered Serpent opened below them as a chamber roughly 40 meters across, lit by bioluminescent moss growing in organized lines across the walls. The altar itself sat at the far end, a raised stone platform carved with the dungeon's central iconography, the Feathered Serpent motif repeating in layered relief. Around it, the tribal formation, 8 mid-tier creatures in the outer ring, 2 captains flanking the platform, and the tribal chief standing motionless at the center of the altar, with the shaman sword laid across both his hands like an offering he intended to protect rather than give. Hyun-woo assessed the formation and asked, quietly, how they wanted to split this. Kim Ho told him to take the outer ring with Shin supporting. The captains and the chief were his. The outer ring came down in about 4 minutes. Hyun-woo worked fast and clean. Sword techniques that Kim Ho recognized from 11 playthroughs as genuinely well-developed for a first year. The kind of fundamental strength that didn't need embellishment. Shin stayed mobile, running interference and picking his moments with the precision of someone who had survived by knowing exactly when to act and when to stay out of the way. Kim Ho took the captains. 2 controlled exchanges, efficient, nothing extended. The tribal chief watched him deal with both of them without moving from the altar, which was exactly what Kim Ho expected. The chief's Phase 1 behavior was territorial. He waited for a direct approach to the altar before engaging. Kim Ho walked up the steps. Phase 1 was manageable. Heavy weapon strikes with a tracking curse layered underneath, which caused significant problems for anyone relying on conventional footwork. Kim Ho used the lightning hummingbird's mobility to redirect the tracking component and kept his positioning tight to the altar's right side, where the chief's attack arc had a structural gap the game had never patched. 4 minutes of work. The chief dropped to one knee. Phase 2 was different. The tribal chief straightened, the shaman sword's energy transferring upward through his arms in a visible channel, and the dungeon responded. The altar platform dropped 3 meters into the floor. The moss lighting shifted toward red, and the area effect began. A pulsing curse field that degraded any defensive technique within its radius, at roughly 20% output per second. Against a standard party, it made coordinated fighting nearly impossible. Against someone alone, it meant you had to end the fight before your own defenses failed entirely. Kim Ho heard Shin call from the outer ring. Hyun-woo's sweep was finished, they were ready to assist. He told them to stay back and hold the exit corridor. He said it in the specific tone he used when the instruction was not a request. What followed lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He used every ability in the correct sequence. Infernal Fist to break the chief's weapon guard. Dragon's Breath as a channeled burst the moment the opening created itself. Wind Technique to extend the knockback and pin the chief against the altar's rear wall. The curse field hit his barrier layers at the 20% degradation rate it promised, and by the end he was working with essentially no active defense. He took 2 direct hits, both landed. He finished the fight standing. The shaman sword lay on the altar floor. He picked it up by the blade side, walked back down the steps, and held it out to Hyun-woo. Hyun-woo didn't immediately take it. He looked at Kim Ho's burned left side, the point where the chief's curse-enhanced strike had connected, with the expression of someone realizing they had misunderstood the nature of the risk their friend had just taken on their behalf. Kim Ho told him to take the sword. He said the injuries were within tolerance. Hyun-woo took the sword and said nothing. He had learned, over the past weeks, that Kim Ho's definition of within tolerance covered a wider range than most people's. and that pressing on it rarely produced useful information. The shaman sword's pairing with Hyunwoo's sealed relic took effect outside the dungeon threshold, a resonance lock that required open air and a completed bonding sequence. Kim-ho walked Hyunwoo through it from the tunnel entrance, while Shin watched the corridor, and Kim-ho held a recovery cloth to his burned side with his free hand. The sealed relic in Hyunwoo's original sword accepted the anchor structure the shaman sword provided, and the pressure reading that had been building for weeks settled into a sustainable range. Hyunwoo stood there afterward looking at the two weapons, the bonded relic and the new anchor piece, with the complicated expression of someone receiving something they feel they haven't yet earned. Kim-ho had seen this exact expression across many playthroughs. It never became easier to address. He told Hyunwoo that what he'd done in the outer ring tonight was the reason the shaman sword existed at all. It was made to pair with a cultivator of his specific method, and it belonged to someone who could actually use it. That was the only earning that mattered. Hyunwoo held the weapons for another moment. He said he would make the investment worthwhile. Kim-ho said he already knew that. The Serpent Chamber was Dungeon 104, a B-rank priority dungeon that the Academy's system opened automatically after 388 was cleared by an affiliated party. The access notification appeared on Kim-ho's student terminal the following morning, which was the only part of this situation that was technically legal. The descent they planned was not. The Chamber's Hallmaster was a different category of threat than the Tribal Chief. Dungeon 104 had been flagged by the Academy as an active containment priority, meaning the Hallmaster inside it represented something close to the ceiling of what the campus dungeon network was supposed to hold. It occupied a fixed position in the chamber's deepest room, and its mechanics were simple: total area dominance, an aggression radius of roughly 30 meters, and an attack pattern that prioritized anything that generated significant combat energy within that radius, which meant the strategy was equally simple, if unpleasant to execute. Kim-ho went in first, alone, and made enough noise to be the most interesting thing in the room. Wind and infernal fist techniques running simultaneously. Loud, energetically distinctive, exactly what the Hallmaster's targeting prioritized. He led it in expanding circles around the chamber, while Hyunwoo and Shin worked through the side passage to the treasure alcove and extracted what the game's item index listed as the dungeon's primary rare drop. The Hallmaster was large and fast. 3 of its strikes connected cleanly over 7 minutes. 2 of them he turned into glancing impacts through footwork. The third was a direct hit that picked him up and deposited him against the chamber's far wall with a crack that resonated through the stone for 2 full seconds. He got up. Shin signaled from the alcove entrance. Extraction complete! Kim-ho used the lightning hummingbird's speed to break the Hallmaster's tracking and sprinted for the exit corridor. Then Hyunwoo's voice came from the passage behind them, not the signal call they'd agreed on. A different sound. Tight. Forced. The particular quality of someone allocating most of their air to staying upright. The White Serpent had been in the secondary chamber. The dungeon's documentation, which Kim-ho had reviewed thoroughly, listed it as dormant. It wasn't dormant. It had moved while they were occupied with the Hallmaster, and it had moved to where Shin and Hyunwoo were coming out. The White Serpent was not the same category as the Hallmaster. It was older, it carried the dungeon's actual bloodline, a purer and more concentrated threat than anything the surface chambers had offered, and it had already responded to Hyunwoo the way it responded to anything carrying sacred relic energy, with focused, personal attention. Hyunwoo told Shin to run. He said it clearly, without negotiation. Shin ran. Kim-ho came back through the passage. What he saw: Hyunwoo standing between the White Serpent and the exit corridor, one hand on his sword, the other braced against the passage wall. The sealed relic inside the sword was active. He'd pulled it open, something he'd avoided doing since they'd left the surface, because the relic's full output wasn't something his body was built to channel yet. The shaman sword's anchor was holding the structural bleed to minimum tolerance, but minimum tolerance was still significant, and the strain showed across every visible part of Hyunwoo's face and shoulders. The sword had a hairline fracture along the lower third of the blade. It had taken a direct impact from the serpent, and it had held, and the holding had cost it. Hyunwoo looked at Kim-ho briefly. He said the passage was clear. He said Kim-ho should go. Kim-ho did not go. What came next was not a clean fight. It was 2 minutes of the most controlled desperation Kim-ho had run in over a year, every technique calibrated not to finish the serpent, which wasn't achievable with what he currently carried, but to split its attention, degrade its tracking, and create enough disruption that Hyunwoo's barrier held long enough for them to move. The relic burned the whole time. Hyunwoo held position the whole time, absorbing impacts that should have ended the engagement, running on the sacred relic's excess output and the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided this was where they stood. They broke for the exit together when Kim Ho forced an opening with a simultaneous Dragon's Breath and Wind Force combination that redirected the serpent into the chamber's rear section. They made the surface 30 seconds later. Shin was waiting. The serpent didn't follow past the dungeon threshold. Hyunwoo sat down on the tunnel floor immediately. The relic went back into the seal. The sword's fracture was visible in full light. Not catastrophic, but significant, and Kim Ho estimated 3 weeks of competent repair work to address it properly. Hyunwoo looked at it with the precise expression of someone who had just found out something they'd trusted had limits. Kim Ho sat next to him. Hyunwoo said, after a long pause, that he thought he'd had it under control. He said he should have had it under control. Kim Ho told him, not immediately, because the moment didn't benefit from speed, that Hyunwoo's control had been the reason they were all sitting on the tunnel floor instead of still being in the chamber. He said that what Hyunwoo had done in that passage was exactly what his bond with the relic was built for, and that the fracture was a cost, not a failure. Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. He said he understood. Kim Ho said he'd been watching people go into these situations for a very long time. He said sometimes the cost was a cracked sword, and sometimes it was worse. He said the reason he ran the preparation the way he did, the way that people occasionally found excessive, was because he had seen what happened when the preparation ran short, and he had no interest in seeing it again. Hyunwoo looked at him. He didn't ask what that meant precisely, which was the response of someone who had already understood what it meant. He said he would be better prepared next time. Kim Ho said they both would. The committee's surface checkpoint caught them coming up through the East Wing access corridor at 40 minutes past the last permitted training hour. 2 junior committee members with active detection arrays and the specific posture of people who had expected to find something. Kim Ho's burn injuries from the Hallmaster encounter were on his left side, under his jacket, which he had buttoned to the collar on the way up. His face showed no relevant expression. He told the committee members, in a cooperative and slightly confused tone, that he and his companions had been running a late study session in Sub-Level 2's reference archive and had lost track of time. The committee members asked about the detection reading from the corridor. Combat energy residue, 3rd tier concentration. Kim Ho said he'd dropped a practice talisman on the stairs. He described the talisman in specific detail. C-rank activation, fire aspected. The kind of thing that would produce exactly the residue signature they were reading. He said he would be more careful about carrying them in pockets without proper sealing. The senior committee member wrote it down, which was the action of someone who didn't fully believe the explanation and also couldn't currently disprove it. She told them to clear the corridor. She filed it under Unverified Incident, Category 3. They cleared the corridor. The mentorship evaluation began in the second half of the second month. Dang Ga-young ran it the same way she ran most things, efficiently and without ceremony. She appeared in front of the versatile class candidates with 3 colored stickers on her jacket, explained that the evaluation consisted of removing all 3 from her person through any combination of legal combat techniques, and gave them a 60-second window to decide their approach before she started moving. Most of the class attempted collaborative pressure, multiple candidates coordinating to limit her angles. She disassembled this in about 40 seconds using shadow magic at a level that made the coordination feel, to the participants, like trying to hold a formation in water. Kim Ho waited. He didn't wait passively. He spent the first wave watching her shadow magic's operational pattern, the specific way she used it not as an offensive tool but as a spatial redistribution technique, folding her position around the room's geometry in ways that made physical prediction close to impossible. He tracked the rhythm. He found where the rhythm had a 4-second interval during transition. On the second wave, he used overheat, a technique that generated intense heat emission from his own body surface, which degraded the shadow magic's spatial anchors enough to reduce her transition speed by half for the interval. First sticker, she adjusted. He adjusted faster, using silent steps, a movement suppression technique that eliminated his approach signature entirely, to close the gap she'd created by compensating for overheat. Second sticker. She stopped adjusting after that and came at him directly, which was the response of someone who had decided that indirect methods weren't going to be sufficient and had made the judgment call to find out what he was actually made of. He used a combat reflex he'd built through the dungeon encounters, not a copied skill, a developed instinct, to pull away from her first attack, let her second pass through the space his shoulder had occupied, and took the third sticker off her collar from behind while her momentum was still carrying forward. She turned around, she looked at him. She said that was better than she'd expected, in the tone of someone who had expected a great deal. She said she would need to revise several assumptions. She asked him when he'd developed the combat instinct he'd used on the third sticker, because it wasn't a skill with a definable source. He said he'd been working on it. He said the dungeon time had been useful. She let that answer sit for a moment, clearly noting that he hadn't answered the question she'd actually asked, and chose not to press it. She told him to come back Tuesday. She had something specific she wanted to test. Tuesday's session was distortion. She explained it the way she explained most things, directly and without extra words. Distortion was a movement trait, extremely rare, that could only develop through sustained close proximity evasion under actual combat pressure. Most practitioners who tried to build it simply took too many hits before the reflex pattern could form. The ones who succeeded did so by putting themselves repeatedly in situations where the margin for error was small enough that the body started building new solutions on its own. She told him she was going to hit him, and he was to stay close, and he was not to block. He didn't block. The session lasted 40 minutes. She landed several clean strikes in the first 10, because the technique she was running was a high-speed combat rhythm that gave the evasion instinct very little data to work from initially. He took the impacts and stayed inside the range she was using, which was the part of the instruction that most people would have abandoned after the third strike. By 20 minutes, his evasion timing had improved measurably. By 30, he was reading her rhythm well enough to make small predictive adjustments. At 37 minutes, he phased through a full-speed forward strike that should have connected solidly to his center, his body reading the weight transfer a fraction before her foot fully committed, and his position shifting on that fraction. Ga Young paused. She said, again. He phased through the next two in sequence. She told him that was distortion, not the full trait, not yet, but the physical pattern the trait was built on. She said with consistent application over the next weeks, the reflex would stabilize. She also said, in a tone she used for observations she meant to keep on record, that she had never seen someone develop the evasion base in a single session before. He told her the dungeon encounters had involved a significant quantity of close-range attacks. He said involuntary repetition was effective. She said she supposed it was. The young woman who appeared at his door on Wednesday was not someone he'd been expecting. Hong Young-hwa was a first year in a different track, an elemental specialist with a fire attribute that the system had registered as an unusual dual-element configuration. She'd heard, through the specific information channels that the Academy's small world generated reliably, that Kim Ho had some expertise with elemental development and unusual skill combinations. She wanted to know if he could help her with a problem her instructors hadn't been able to address. She showed him the issue. Her fire attribute was listed as standard C rank on every official record, which was accurate to what she could currently produce. The attribute's actual classification, water flame, a rare dual-nature fire that could operate at extremely high or low temperatures simultaneously, was what she'd been unable to access. The attribute was there. The technique for activating the second temperature register wasn't something her instruction had covered. Kim Ho recognized it immediately from the game's item index. He also recognized what it was worth. Not to her, specifically, but to what he was building. A water flame capability could operate as both a high heat source and a thermal shock generator simultaneously. And the blacksmith shop 2 blocks from the Academy's main gate had a supply of eternal iron that no conventional heat source could work. Eternal iron was what he needed for the next stage of the ultimate weapon project. He told Young-hwa he could help her develop the dual register access. He said he knew a suitable environment for it. The blacksmith's forge was not designed for student use, but the owner, a retired adventurer named Park who had not retired gracefully, was willing to negotiate access in exchange for a demonstration of genuine capability. Kim Ho explained what Young-hwa's water flame could do when properly activated. Park said he'd believe it when he saw it. The activation required thermal contrast, applying the fire attribute at its high heat register against the forge's coolant-treated metal, which forced a rapid temperature differential that dragged the low heat register into operation alongside it. Younghwa's first 3 attempts produced only the high register, which was what she always produced. On the 4th attempt, he adjusted her output angle by 8 degrees, not a technique correction, a targeting adjustment, and the thermal contrast hit the threshold it needed. The water flame's low temperature register activated, the dual nature fully operational for the first time since the attribute had manifested, and the differential it created against the forge's treated metal was extraordinary. The coolant process steel responded to the thermal shock the way it was designed to respond, which was to say it held. The eternal iron, however, was a different material with different tolerances, and under sustained dual-temperature water flame application it began to work. Younghwa held the technique for 4 minutes, which was longer than she'd ever sustained any single elemental application. She came out of it looking slightly stunned, not from effort, but from the specific surprise of discovering a thing you've had for a long time and only just learned to use. Park looked at the worked eternal iron and said nothing for a moment. He set it aside and told them they were welcome back. Kim Ho took the worked eternal iron under his arm and thanked Younghwa, who seemed uncertain whether to be pleased about the result or concerned about what she'd been used for. He said honestly that the activation she'd achieved was real. The technique was hers now, and she could apply it without him present. The eternal iron was a side benefit he'd anticipated. That didn't make her development any less genuine. She thought about this for a moment. She said she supposed that was a reasonable position. She said she'd come to him if she ran into other wall problems. He said she knew where to find him. The Guardian evaluation arrived at the end of the 3rd week with the specific energy of an assessment that had been designed to be stressful and had succeeded. Dang Ga Young announced the format 2 hours before it began. Pairs of students assigned to defend a target structure, in this case, a stone goddess statue in the Eastern Practice Courtyard, against sustained monster waves under her personal command. The waves were not staged for comfort. She was running them at the level her shadow magic could sustain, which was well above what first-year students were typically expected to manage. Kim Ho was paired with Song Chun-hee. This was not an accident. Ga Young's assignment pairings were never accidental. Chun-hee had spent the past month losing every peripheral bet she'd made with Kim Ho on their respective performance outcomes. She had assumed, based on his public record, that she had a performance edge in every category, and the evidence had been running consistently against that assumption without her being able to identify why. She was competitive enough that this bothered her. She was honest enough that she'd stopped pretending it didn't. She appeared at the courtyard entrance and told Kim Ho, without preamble, that she would handle the forward wave pressure and he would handle the statue's rear quadrant. She said she didn't need tactical guidance. He agreed to the positioning without disagreement. The first wave came 3 minutes into the evaluation. Standard goblin formation, mid-tier, organized enough to indicate Ga Young had applied some coordination directive to them. Chun-hee's lightning magic hit the leading edge hard and accurately. Kim Ho set barrier layers around the statue's rear and side flanks, positioned so the coverage overlapped her forward field in the areas her lateral movement left temporarily exposed. She didn't notice the overlap for the first 2 waves. She was focused on the engagement in front of her, which was where the pressure was concentrated. The 3rd wave came from a different angle. Ga Young had split the formation, sending a flanking group around the courtyard's left perimeter, while the main body continued frontal pressure. The flanking group hit Kim Ho's barriers. They held, and the barrier layer redirected the flankers into Chun-hee's peripheral range where she dispatched them cleanly. She noticed. She kept her eyes on the next wave's approach and said, without looking at him, that he had anticipated the flank. He said the wave spacing had suggested a split was coming. She was quiet for 3 seconds. She said he could have warned her directly. He said if he'd warned her, she would have shifted her forward coverage to address the anticipated flank, which would have opened the frontal approach at the exact moment the main body hit its peak density. Another pause. She said the main body did hit peak density approximately then. He said it had. The 4th wave arrived before she could continue the conversation, which was probably better for both of them. The goddess statue behind them absorbed a direct impact from a projectile that Chun-hee hadn't fully redirected. The stone cracked at the base, structural damage beginning to accumulate on the evaluation target. Simultaneously, the wave's back formation resolved into something the standard goblin profile didn't cover: an intelligence-directed ranged configuration, coordinated suppression fire, aimed at maintaining both of them in positions where the statue couldn't receive effective defense coverage. These weren't standard goblins. Ga-young had added a command structure to the wave at some point in the past 5 minutes, which was the kind of adaptation that turned a difficult evaluation into one that required real decisions. Kim-ho looked at the incoming ranged formation, the cracked statue base, and Chun-hee's current position, and began moving before he'd finished the calculation. The ranged formation had spread across 3 positions along the courtyard's upper perimeter. Elevated terrain that Ga-young had constructed into the evaluation space specifically because elevated ranged attacks created coverage problems that couldn't be solved by simply hitting things harder. 11 goblins in a coordinated arc, each carrying a thrown weapon loaded with a condensed impact charge that roughly doubled the force their tier would normally produce. It was an efficiently designed problem. Kim-ho ran the geometry in the space of 3 strides. The statue had 2 undefended rear corners, the quadrants Chun-hee's forward stance left exposed, because covering them would have required pulling back from the frontal pressure she was managing. The ranged formation was targeting exactly those corners, which answered the question of whether the attack was opportunistic. Ga-young had read Chun-hee's positioning and built the ranged arc to exploit it. That was the kind of assessment that turned evaluations into something closer to surgery. He reached the statue's rear right corner and set a barrier with the minimum efficient output rather than the safe margin, because the safe margin was no longer available. Then he ran the left. The first volley hit while he was still moving. 4 of the 11 projectiles made it through. 2 at the statue's left flank, 1 directly on the existing base crack, and 1 that Kim-ho took on his own barrier at half-step range because his timing was approximately half a second short of where it needed to be. The impact pushed him sideways. He kept his feet. The base crack widened by 2 centimeters. Chun-hee's voice came from the forward line, not a question. She said she was pulling back to give him a clear sight line to the upper perimeter. He processed the offer in the time it took him to reset the second barrier. Chun-hee pulling back meant the frontal wave pressure would advance to the statue's forward face before she could re-establish her line. Solving the upper perimeter problem while opening a second problem directly ahead was not a solution. He told her to hold exactly where she was. He said 2 seconds. She held. The frontal wave hit her coverage line, and he heard her lightning find the lead formation, and he stopped tracking the space in front of the statue and dealt with the upper perimeter. The lightning hummingbird was a single-target technique. 1 shot, 1 destination. But the copy he carried had been worked through weeks of core refinement, and when he released 3 in rapid sequence, timed at the exact interval the ranged formation needed to reset between throws, the disruption hit enough of the arc to force 6 positions out of optimal range. The remaining 5 got off a second volley before his cycle could recover. 2 more impacts on the statue. Cracks running from the base toward the midsection in the slow, specific way of structural failure with a time limit. The frontal wave collapsed on Chun-hee's position 40 seconds later, not because her coverage broke, but because the wave's second tier had been carrying disruption talismans that scattered on impact and created a localized interference field, reducing lightning output to 60% within a 3-meter radius. She detonated 2 of them before she identified what they were. Her secondary technique, a short-range thunderstrike operating on a different frequency, fell below the interference threshold, and she ran it fast and clean through the remaining forward elements. The pivot cost her 3 seconds. The flanking detachment used those 3 seconds. Kim-ho stepped into the flank line from the courtyard's right side and took the leading element directly, a barrier layered over a forceful wind push that absorbed the impact and sent the flanking formation into each other at enough velocity to collapse their advance. He held the position for a count of 6, which was as long as his mana situation could honestly sustain active output, then let the existing barriers carry the remaining load. Chun-hee cleared the disrupted forward section and reset her line. She looked over her shoulder at the position he'd just vacated. She didn't say anything. The evaluation continued. The statue sat at roughly 60% structural integrity by the midpoint of the session. Between the 5th and 6th waves, the courtyard went quiet for 90 seconds, the longest pause the evaluation had offered. Chun-hee came to stand at the statue's base. She looked at the spreading cracks and then at Kim-ho, and she asked, In the tone she used when attempting something approaching directness, how he read formation patterns as quickly as he did. She said most of what he'd done in Wave 4 looked like prediction. He thought about how much of this was useful to share. He told her he'd spent a long time watching how things failed. He said when you'd seen a situation's breaking point often enough, the road toward it became recognizable before you arrived. She asked how long he'd been doing this. He said longer than was easy to explain. She let the answer sit there without pressing it, which surprised him slightly. 3 weeks earlier she would have pressed. She asked instead, with the precision of someone recalibrating a working model, whether his mana reserves could hold through the next wave at the same coverage density. He gave her the honest answer. He said not at the same density. He said the rear quadrants were going to need her attention from Wave 6 onward if the ranged elements returned. She said she heard him. The wave bell sounded before he could verify whether she'd meant it. She had meant it. Wave 6 came in standard spread, mid-size, nothing that announced itself, and Chun-Hee held the frontal line while splitting her attention between the forward approach and the rear perimeter, in a way that was, compared to her Wave 1 positioning, a measurably different relationship with the space she was occupying. She picked up the first ranged flanking attempt before it reached the statue and redirected it with a lateral thunder strike she'd been developing all session. The statue held. Kim Ho took the command element. The wave's coordination dissolved inward from the edges the way it always did when the organizing center went down, and 30 seconds later the courtyard was clear again. Chun-Hee stood in the quiet with her hair loose from whatever arrangement it had started in, which she hadn't stopped to fix across the last 3 waves. She looked at the cleared space, and then at him, and said that she had underestimated several things at the beginning of this evaluation. He said she had also correctly estimated several things. She said she was trying to make an honest statement and he could let her finish it. He said he was listening. She said she'd assumed his forward positioning choices were defensive instinct, the same thing any reasonably experienced student did under pressure. She said she'd been wrong about that. She asked him, directly, where he had actually learned to think about combat the way he thought about it, because it was not from the Academy's first-year curriculum. He sat with that question for a moment. He told her, and it was true, that most of it came from watching things go badly. He said he had watched people he cared about reach situations they couldn't survive, across more iterations than he could count with any usefulness, and at some point the pattern recognition stopped being effort and became something he couldn't turn off. He said he found it difficult to enter any situation without automatically locating its failure modes. She was quiet for a long time. She asked if that was exhausting. He said he had made his peace with it. She looked at the statue's cracks. She said that seemed like a significant thing to make peace with. He said most significant things were, the wave bell sounded again, and the moment closed the way. Moments between waves always closed, abruptly, with no ceremony, because the evaluation's design didn't build in space for ceremony. Wave 7 was larger than anything the session had fielded. 40 goblins, siege configuration, 3-tier formation with a vanguard moving as a unit rather than individuals. The command layer from Wave 5 was back and more visible, a single goblin at the second tier's center wearing a distinct marker, and the formation moved outward from that center in a coherent pattern that did not look like instinct. Chun-Hee ran her initial lightning sequence into the vanguard, and it split to distribute the current across multiple targets, reducing her effective output significantly. She recalibrated immediately to single-target rapid sequencing. Kim Ho addressed the command element. He used silent steps to clear the outer formation before the vanguard could redirect, reached the command goblin at the second tier, and dropped it in 3 strikes. The formation's coordination dissolved from the outside in. Chun-Hee's lightning found its depth and pushed through the outer tier in 2 sustained volleys. Kim Ho took the second tier with wind and the remaining physical technique his mana could sustain cleanly. The courtyard went quiet for what he estimated was the last time this evaluation would offer. He ran a fast internal count on his mana reserve. The number it returned was honest and not generous. Wave 8 arrived and everything changed. The courtyard gate opened, the initial formation came through, and 40 seconds into the engagement the gate opened again. What came through it was not another goblin wave. It was taller than anything the evaluation had fielded, armored in a way that suggested the plating was structural to the body rather than worn over it, carrying a weapon across its back that required 2 contact points. It moved through the active goblins without breaking stride, and the goblins parted ahead of it without being directed to. which answered the question of where the Wave 5 command layer had actually originated. The coordination the evaluation had been building through every wave had been a single intelligence, operating from outside the engagement, establishing patterns and probing responses. An elite boss, supervisor tier, the kind of addition to a mentor-run assessment that meant the mentor had decided the ceiling hadn't been found yet and intended to locate it. Kim Ho looked at it for one full second. Ga Young sat at the observation post in the courtyard's northeast corner with a small notebook open. She was writing in it. She did not look up. Chun-hee said, in a very controlled voice, that she did not recall an elite boss being mentioned during the briefing. He said it hadn't been. She said that seemed like information they could have used. He said Ga Young had a working theory about what evaluations were for, and he thought they were currently inside that theory. The boss stopped at the courtyard's center and performed its own assessment, tracking them, the statue, the distance to each, running whatever internal calculation it used to identify optimal approach. The intelligence in the motion was categorically above the goblin formations. This wasn't territorial instinct. It was operational awareness, and the operation it was assessing was pointed at the goddess statue. Chun-hee said they needed a plan, and said it fast. He told her, sustained pressure from her maximum safe distance, targeting the boss's left side where the armor plating was heaviest. Not because hitting the strongest side would do more damage, it wouldn't, but because consistent pressure there would build a directional lean away from it that created positioning opportunities he could use at close range. He needed her to maintain it regardless of what the boss did in response, because the response was something he was managing from the front, and he needed to know exactly where her output was landing at all times. She asked what he was planning to do at close range against an elite boss with what remained of his mana. He said he had enough for what he was planning. This covered the techniques he intended to use. It did not cover a meaningful margin for error, which was a detail he decided didn't need to travel with her into the next 30 seconds. She held his look. She said if the statue dropped below 40%, she was pulling both of them back regardless of his position. He said that was fair. She moved to her distance and checked her own positioning relative to the statue's axis before stopping, a small adjustment to her left foot that widened her stability base for sustained output. 3 weeks ago, she had walked onto the placement exam mat expecting to prove something. She was standing at correct range with correct form, running a specific technique he'd asked for because she'd decided to trust it, and the distance between those two versions of her was not a small distance. The boss moved. The first exchange was a test. The boss used a horizontal sweep with enough force that the displacement wave hit Kim Ho before the weapon did, and he let it push him rather than bracing, using the momentum to reposition to the boss's right side. Chun-hee's lightning connected with the left simultaneously, and the directional lean began building into its footwork. The second exchange was harder. The boss had registered the push redirect pattern and angled its third strike low, a compensation he couldn't manage with the same movement. He took it on a barrier that cracked but held. The impact drove him back 6 meters across the courtyard stone. He stopped and checked his mana. The number had not improved. The distortion reflex arrived without a deliberate decision. The recognition pattern built through the first 3 exchanges, completing its circuit before the 4th strike landed. His body was already vacating the space when the weapon came through. The swing passed through air where his shoulder had been. He was positioned at the boss's rear left before the strike finished. He released the infernal fist into the joint between its armored shoulder and its torso. The impact sound was different from anything else the evaluation had produced. A deep compression, felt as much as heard. Significant force meeting significant resistance with neither fully conceding. The boss staggered 1 step. A single step from something massing 4 times what he did was a real result. It was not a sufficient result. The statue groaned. Not from a strike. From the internal logic of accumulated structural stress finding a new equilibrium, the base cracks having worked far enough through the midsection that the stone was beginning to distribute its own weight differently. Chun-hee called the number from her position, 50%, possibly less. The boss looked at him. Then it looked at the statue. It had run the same calculation he'd run, identified the statue as the closer threshold to failure, and turned toward it with the patient efficiency of something that had determined the optimal path. Kim Ho was in front of it before it completed the turn. He had a 6-meter lead and enough mana remaining for 1 significant technique at full output, or a sustained barrier series running approximately 90 seconds before the well ran empty. The dragon's breath was charged and ready, and using it in a supervised evaluation, in front of an instructor who was already building something in that notebook, would close questions he was not prepared to have closed. He chose the barriers. The boss drove forward, and he felt the force transfer up through both arms and along his spine, and he held the barrier against it, while Chun-Hee's lightning struck the left side in the sustained pattern he'd asked for, and the boss pressed forward with the even patience of something that understood time was on its side, and the 90-second window began its count. 40 seconds in, the statue's midsection cracked with the sound of something that had been trying to hold on finally deciding it couldn't. 45%. Ga-young looked up from her notebook. The boss drove again, harder, and Kim Ho absorbed it on the barrier's remaining structural capacity, less than half of where it had started, and held his footing on the courtyard stone with both feet planted, while the last reliable margin of everything he'd carried into this evaluation burned down toward the line where decisions ran out. Chun-Hee's lightning hit the boss's left side 3 more times in fast succession, and each one moved it fractionally, and fractionally was not enough. The barrier cracked. Not shattered, cracked holding, but with the specific quality of something that had found its outer edge and was now operating past it. He felt it in his hands. He felt it in the mana he was spending to keep it there. He looked at the distance between the boss and the statue and calculated how many seconds the barrier would hold against this continued pressure. The number was not a comfortable number. Behind him, the goddess statue shifted on its damaged base. A slow, heavy movement, stone grinding on stone, the midsection cracks propagating in the specific direction that preceded a structural column beginning to lean. Ga-young closed her notebook and stood up from the observation post. The boss pressed forward and Kim Ho pressed back, and everything that the evaluation had been building toward, every wave, every formation, every adaptation, every decision he had made and every one he hadn't, arrived at this exact point simultaneously. The goddess statue at 45% and leaning, his barriers at their outermost edge, and whatever Ga-young intended by standing up now crossing the courtyard toward them.